It's 2:30 in the morning, and I was watching a video, Kier Gaines. I was watching some of the content that he was doing, and there was one video he did, and it hit right. And I was like, and then the idea just came to me when I was like, you know what, I would like to do a segment where I just talk about life lessons that I've learned. It's sort of like a audio biography at the same time. It's really just me being able to give advice, or well, yeah, give advice to the people coming next, or really just anyone in general who would decide to listen to another perspective. I would like to talk about my upbringing for my first topic. So when it comes to this, I'm gonna try and be as open and vulnerable as I can without giving up too much information that will be like super personal to people related to the story, like family and friends. It's always uncomfortable talking about my upbringing, at least to some extent, because in some instances, of course, it's a lot of happiness and a lot of joy. And other parts, it's not great. It's not fun. It's not to say that I have the worst or the most traumatic background. Um, Honestly, it's not even close. But it's bad in its own way. So I was raised by a single mom. Now, my mother was going through a lot, raising, like she had 3 kids. I'm the youngest. Um, the middle child is my brother. The oldest is my sister. I was more independent, I guess. Mom describes me as the independent one. I was the type who would, if I got in trouble, I'd make up a punishment for myself. So I want to touch on parenting in the sense of discipline, bringing up like the next generation. But it's really in the sense of you have the millennials who believe that some millennials who believe that they're like the best generation. And I don't really believe that there was a best generation. I don't believe there is at all, because a lot of generations have their own flaws. You have a lot who believe that whooping your child was the best, or relatively the best form of discipline. And I beg to differ. And it's not because of, oh, it's abuse. No, I believe in some instances a good whooping is qualified. But when it's the sole disciplinary action that you take, I believe that's where things start to get misconstrued, because there are plenty of other disciplinary actions that you can do. So growing up, I put myself through a lot of things, and I was put through a lot of things growing up. And through all of it, I learned a lot. Reteach myself the things that I once believed was correct. I was having to reteach myself. I was having to essentially grow up again. I mean, you don't fully grow up until you're 25, and it's not until, at least I guess, you're my age, or maybe sometime after you turn 25, that you realize, shoot, man, not even your parents know what they were doing. And I honestly, I think I'm at that point. And you don't realize how messed up your family could possibly be until you reach semi-adulthood, if not just straight up adulthood. I mean, I'm not saying like I have the worst family ever. No, I have a great loving family. It's just you never realize how far things could have gotten, how crazy things could have gotten. And then you have to sit there and just deal with it and accept it for what it is, which is not the easiest thing to do because you never thought that that would happen. You never thought you would be that kind of family. And that's not an easy thing to accept. Yeah, you have to live with it. And then there's the lessons growing up that you was taught by family members that you essentially would have to discard it and throw it away. You learn to filter what it is that your elders say to you and teach you, and then you have to go back and then think of all those things that your elders said to you because you realize they weren't being taught correctly either. Once again, we can bounce this on over to parenting styles, like simply like whoopings. I shoot, at least when I was 20, 19 or 20, I was like, yeah, I probably whoop my kids too. I am now 22, and that ideal has completely changed for me. I no longer believe that whoopings are something that should be done. Rather, I'm not completely opposed to it, but I believe that that is essentially the last resort. And I mean the absolute last resort. Like the child would have had to done something completely stupid, completely idiotic, dangerous even. But children are essentially mirrors. They mirror what you do, and they essentially learn what you teach them, even the things that you don't essentially teach them, in the sense of you don't verbally say. Rather, they observe the actions that speak louder than words. When you're whooping them, which let's be honest, a lot of parents do that out of frustration. They what they really see is the frustration, which they come to understand that when I'm frustrated, you hit someone. Now, that's not exactly something that you want to teach them because then you have to reteach them that. Now, the bigger part of this is that if they go to school, they learn to hit the other kid when they get frustrated because that's what they learned from you. Anyone who works academically, are taught that children who hit essentially learn that from parents, which means that the parent is hitting at home, which essentially means that A, their disciplinary style is whoopings, or B is abuse. So it's one or the other. You teach them social norms from the moment that they are able to observe you. And if the social norm in the household is whoopings, they will learn that and you will have to reteach them. That is one of many reasons why I would never condone something like whoopings. That's definitely something for older children. And even then, I still wouldn't even, I'd still be trying to look for better ways to just discipline a child. It's the easiest method, but it comes with its own issues in of itself. You were basically also raised where you would fear the whooping, which would prevent you from committing the action. But then you learn to, or at least in my experience, you learn to fear the individual. And to be perfectly honest with you, I grew up fearing my grandma. It wasn't until I was 13 or 14 that I got over that fear. But that put, and to be honest, it put a hindrance on my relationship with her. I had to do a lot of, I had to do a reassessment of myself and my feelings and regulating my own perspective of everything. And to be frank, you shouldn't have to do that to try and reestablish a relationship with someone, to understand the relationship that you have with someone. Because I mean, sure, over the years it slowly went away, but from, I was always going to be standoffish because I grew up fearing her. And it wasn't the good fear, it was the fear of not wanting to get a whooping from her because I felt like I could get a whooping for simply breathing. That's not an environment that you should have to be around as a child. And it could come off as being too soft or anything of the sort, but I would challenge that perspective on something like it being too soft, which is another thing that I was reassessing. You are a child growing up in an unfamiliar world. From the moment that you are essentially born, you are learning feelings, you are learning emotions, you are learning regulating emotions. You're learning all those things. You're experiencing all of that for the first time, and you need to be in a safe environment where you can be in a safe space to regulate and not get in trouble for trying to understand and regulate emotions. You shouldn't be punished for simply doing that. If anything, you should be being taught how to regulate emotions, being taught social norms, what's okay and not okay, not being punished for not performing the correct social norm in that instance. Just because you have to repeat yourself every so often to the child doesn't mean that they should be getting a whooping just because you have to repeat yourself a third time. Yes, disciplinary action is always okay, but it needs to be the correct form of discipline. If anything, my professor told me when it comes to raising a child, the discipline should always relate to the situation. I can't see, and if we're taking that stance, I don't see a situation where whoopings make sense, where a child would need to be getting a whooping as a consequence for something that they did wrong. If a child is new to the world and they're experiencing life for the first time, they should be in a safe environment to learn regulating their emotions, understanding how to express themselves, and how to go forward with those things. Boundaries, what's okay and not okay. How to act in this time, in this time, in this time. Learning to listen and obeying the higher authority rather than rebelling. And all that can be done in a very safe environment, and still they understand discipline without beatings. A child should always feel safe when it comes to self-expression, which being in a household when it comes to whoopings as a form of discipline, it usually hinders self-expression. Especially if you're not helping the child regulate their emotions after a beating, which if you were if you lived in my household, or at the very least in my family, that wasn't all too common. Learning to self-express, at least in my household, you did learn a little bit on that. But when it came down down to at least my auntie's side or my grandma's side, in my experience, I didn't see that too often. You end up having to make up for the lack of self-expression because it was hindered while growing up. Because any form of self-expression could eventually be perceived as a challenge on the parent figure, when in actuality, the child is not trying to rebel against the parent authority, rather they are trying to gain understanding, and that is seen as a challenge. I wasn't really able to express myself all that much. Rather, I had to learn to express myself through recording videos. Recording videos where I felt like I could actually express myself without being judged, or essentially someone could finally listen to what I have to say. Because growing up, it wasn't my parent who didn't allow me to express myself. Rather, let's also refer to siblings. Siblings could also hinder your growth. Because let's be real, if you have a older sibling, there can also be a sort of they could be like a guardian or like a secondary parent figure. So, not to mention they're also your sibling, so they could also be a cause for the hindrance on your development, even unintentionally. Which, I'll be honest, I do believe that at least my brother was a bit of a hindrance on my development. Actually, no, I would push it further. My brother and my twin cousin, as I like to call them, I would say they were probably mainly the biggest hindrance on my development, unintentionally. So, and that was simply due to the fact that they essentially bullied me. Now, it could sound soft, it could sound weak, but no, I would, speaking objectively here, it was a hindrance. You can't really express yourself or feel confident in yourself if no one listens and they don't respect you at all. Now, of course, my twin cousin, we spoke about it before. He just didn't want me to be soft, but how could I stand up for myself if I know I'm gonna get beat for standing up for myself? And I can't challenge someone who is literally stronger than I am. I can hardly demand respect from the same person who could beat me without trying. It dampens your confidence. It not only dampens your confidence, but it also makes you less likely to want to speak at all, because you don't feel respected, and if anything, you would also feel like they have something against you. Boundaries don't feel heard, so you feel like there's no one would respect any boundaries that you have because they never respected yours. You don't feel heard when you speak because no one listens, and you would also essentially feel like they don't care for you, or they don't even care about you. And then you have to reteach yourself that they do. They were just immature, and they also were practically in the same position as you was in growing up, because they didn't have a father figure. So they didn't have anyone to really teach them what it's like to, what it is to be a man, and what a man's supposed to do, and respect, and all that, So they were literally just in the same position as you was in, and you suffered the consequence for it. And although it's not your fault, that is now something that you have to deal with and regulate. you're responsible for not projecting that onto the next person. It's not fair, but that's essentially, well, I don't know how you're supposed to feel about that. It's not fair, but I mean, that's life, I guess. So, I mean, there's also learning what your parents would never teach you, or learning from the lack of what your parents taught you, I guess, to be more accurate. The absence of it could honestly be the gold mine for learning later on to not throw or to not fail in the next generation. You see, to put in perspective, my mother wasn't really wasn't the authoritative figure in the house. She was, but she wasn't. Meaning, she didn't do a lot of authority in the house, or at the very least, you learn to respect her authority without it being like an iron fist. Now, of course, this had its own drawbacks because that means that she was respected, but not entirely, because one, she wasn't always present, and two, you have a teenager who's almost an adult, and then you have a teenager who's about to become an adult. So, of course, there's going to be some rebellion, and her not always being able to be there would mean that they would be able to rebel a lot more freely without her knowledge. So, of course, this on the flip side, when it came down to my auntie, I learned her parenting style, or at least just a little bit from what I could get from the years that I had with her, which was she ruled with an iron fist. Now, this also had its drawbacks, and not to sound sexist, but really, I don't think a mother should ever have to raise children on their own. Rather, there should always be two parents in the house. But due to the fact that she was raising them with an iron fist and she had no patience, that also had drawbacks of its own. But I learned that there should be a balance when I got older. So I learned that there should be a balance between disciplinary action and also being able to let things slide when necessary. There is a balance between the two. And that's not always the easiest thing to accomplish, especially when you're the sole parent figure and you're new. And the lack of it is what taught me the balance necessary for raising children. It sucks to be in a house where you didn't really feel too comfortable around your brother, or at the very least, you didn't feel the most safest all the time, just because he bothered you, or at least there was a somewhat lack of boundaries that wasn't respected. The love is still there. The love will always be there. And of course, it takes time to learn that it wasn't hostility, it was just the lack thereof. Which now hinders how close you could have been to someone. And then you realize that the lack thereof hindered the relationship that could have been, hindered the things that could have been. And then you have to accept that and then try to figure out where to go from there. And I think there was some part of me that resented the constant bullying and the lack thereof of all those things, because I've had to put myself back together and piece things back together and regulate and then reteach myself the things that I wasn't allowed to have because of that. I've had to teach myself things like having confidence. I'm having to learn to have a voice because I was never permitted to have one growing up. I've been having to, and it's still hard trying to have a voice when you feel constantly challenged every time that you try to speak. So then you teach yourself to speak through a darn camera, which was fun for you until you realized why you've started loving to do it. Essentially, it was just a way of coping. Fun, but also a way of coping with the lack thereof. So teaching myself to gain my own self-confidence, giving myself my own voice, the voice that I didn't have, along with anything else that I wasn't given or allowed to have. And being in, I guess the third one was like self-expression. I think that's one of the other hard things to have is being able to express myself freely, because I'm a naturally stoic but also charismatic and silly. And I don't always feel safe enough to show that side of myself because I feel like I'll be judged or condemned for it. Even when you know that you won't, but you don't feel safe because you know that someone might challenge you or look at you a certain way because of it. It's not fair to feel that way or have to deal with that, but you just have to teach yourself, and that's the part that sucks, is realizing that you have to teach yourself those things to be safe enough to do it, to give yourself the safe environment to do it because no one gave you that safe environment growing up. So growth in parenting, I would say those are things that I've learned growing up, at least to some extent. Growing up could also be the time to filter the things that you've been taught, to not, to take into consideration what you have been taught, and then filter out the noise that could just be chains from past generations trying to tie you up. Because what is gospel to one generation may not be gospel to the next one. What worked for them does not always work for you. And in truth, if we're being honest, it probably didn't even work for them. They just think that it did. I'm not here to sit here and be like, I'm broken or anything like that. I am relatively fine, relatively speaking. I'm fine. I'm just piecing together. I mean, I'm fine for the most part. Just looking back and thinking about all those things. It's not a fun thing to do, but it's the objective fact of the matter that that's what I lived with. That's what I have to accept, and that's what I have to move forward with when it comes to dealing with the family that I have now, and not looking back, but looking forward and what can I do now to make things better. I mean, once again, I want to say that this is not to disrespect anyone, especially my family, because I know some of them are going to see this. It is not to disrespect anyone in the family. This is just my perspective on what it was like for me growing up, and it's really just honestly to put into perspective and to offer a different perspective for those listening. It's just me giving a perspective to people who may also be growing up or are raising children, and they ought to hear a different perspective on parenting and growth and how it could affect their child, or even allow them to be more aware of how they grew up and what they could essentially might project onto their children. Speaking from someone who grew up in not exactly the best household ever, or in the best family, which is why it is, if I'm saying the right word here, paramount to be very cautious as to who you allow around your children, who you allow to influence them, and who you allow to, well, really, yeah, just be around them. Because we are essentially the byproducts of our social environment, or really just a byproduct of our environment. That's not to say it's 100%, because I could have turned out a lot worse. But if you're allowed to be, if you get to a point where you're self-aware, then you end up becoming at least, or you end up being in a position that I am. Recognizing it, reevaluating, regulating, and putting it in a objective point of view. Seeing it, but not letting it dictate who you are. That's all I got on this one. See you on the next one.